Commander Zexthara looked at the human ships through her viewing screen and felt nothing but disappointment. She had spent 300 years watching different alien races fight wars across the galaxy. She knew what real warships looked like. These human vessels were tiny, ugly, and clearly built with cheap materials. The Valdorian Republic had sent her to observe these new creatures called humans. They wanted to join the Galactic Defense Council, but Zexthara could not understand why. Their technology was at least 50 years behind everyone else. Their weapons were basic energy cannons that most civilized worlds had stopped using decades ago. Even their armor looked like it was made from scrap metal. Captain Jake Morrison stood in front of the council chambers, presenting Earth's military capabilities. He was a tall human with short brown hair and confident eyes. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, but the numbers he gave were pathetic. Earth had only 42 warships in their entire fleet. The smallest member world in the council had at least 200 vessels. "We know we are not the strongest race in the galaxy," Morrison said to the assembled alien delegates. "But we are willing to do our part to defend peaceful worlds from threats." Zexthara almost laughed. These humans talked about defending other worlds when they could barely defend themselves. Their home planet had no energy shields, no orbital defense platforms, and no space stations with serious weapons. Any decent pirate fleet could probably conquer Earth in less than a week. The council members whispered among themselves in various alien languages. Most of them seemed amused by the human presentation. Admiral Korth of the Nexus Coalition made a clicking sound that meant he found something funny. General Vex from the Hive Worlds kept her 4 eyes focused on her datapad, clearly bored by the whole meeting. "What makes you think you can help us?" asked Chancellor Rex, the head of the council. His blue skin glowed slightly as he spoke, which meant he was curious but not impressed. Lieutenant Lisa Martinez, the human tactical officer, stepped forward. She was shorter than Morrison, with dark hair tied back and serious brown eyes. She activated a holographic display that showed battle formations and tactical plans. "We understand that we lack advanced technology," Martinez said, "but we have studied every major conflict in galactic history. We learn fast and we adapt to new situations quickly." The display showed human ships arranged in strange patterns that made no sense to Zexthara. In proper military formations, large ships stayed in the center while smaller vessels protected them from the flanks. The human formations looked random, with ships scattered across space like debris after an explosion. "What is this tactical arrangement supposed to accomplish?" asked General Vex, finally looking up from her datapad. "Flexibility," Martinez replied. "When we do not know what enemy we will face, we prepare for anything." Zexthara shook her head silently. These humans did not understand basic military science. You could not prepare for everything. Successful warfare required detailed planning, based on known enemy capabilities. You studied your opponent, identified their weaknesses, and designed specific strategies to exploit those weaknesses. This human approach of general preparation was the thinking of amateurs. The council voted to give humans associate membership, which meant they could participate in minor defensive operations but not major campaigns. Most members voted yes, not, because they believed humans could help, but because Earth was so weak that it posed no political threat to anyone. The humans were assigned to defend the outer rim territories near the Helix Nebula. This was the galactic equivalent of guard duty at an empty warehouse. Nothing important ever happened in that region of space. Pirates sometimes raided mining colonies, but real military threats never bothered with such worthless territory. Morrison accepted the assignment with enthusiasm that surprised Zexthara. Most species would have been insulted by such an unimportant posting. Either humans were too stupid to understand they had been given busy work, or they genuinely wanted to help, defend innocent civilians regardless of strategic value. "We will not let you down," Morrison promised the council. After the humans left, the council members discussed their impressions. Admiral Korth said the humans reminded him of the Kellen race, which had gone extinct after challenging an enemy 10 times their size. General Vex compared them to domestic pets that thought they were as dangerous as wild predators. "They will learn the realities of galactic warfare quickly," said Chancellor Rex. "Either they will become more realistic about their capabilities, or they will become another entry in the historical database of failed civilizations. Zexithara received orders to monitor human activities in the Outer Rim. Her superiors wanted regular reports on how these new council members performed their duties. She suspected the reports would be short and boring. The humans would probably patrol empty space for a few months, realize how pointless their assignment was, and quietly withdraw from galactic affairs. 2 weeks later, Zexithara established her observation post on the edge of human patrol territory. She watched their ships move through space in those same strange formations Martinez had shown the council. The pattern still made no sense, but at least the humans were taking their duties seriously. Captain Morrison's ship, the UES Defiant, led a small group of vessels on regular patrols through asteroid fields and nebula clouds. They investigated every signal, no matter how weak. They responded to every distress call, even from ships belonging to species that were not council members. The human crews worked longer shifts than regulations required. When they found damaged civilian vessels, they shared their own supplies and spare parts without asking for payment. When they encountered refugees fleeing from pirate attacks, they provided escort services to safe harbors. Zex quote, Thera had to admit that humans were dedicated to their responsibilities. But dedication without capability was useless in real warfare. She had seen countless species with good intentions get destroyed by enemies who cared nothing for noble ideals. Then the long-range scanners detected something that changed everything. Deep space monitoring stations reported unusual energy signatures moving toward the galactic edge. The readings matched historical data for only one known threat. The Krillian swarm. The Krillians were a nightmare that appeared every few centuries. They came from dark space beyond the galaxy's edge, conquering everything in their path. Their ships were living creatures bred for war, capable of rapid healing and adaptation. Their warriors felt no fear and accepted no surrender. 17 star systems had fallen to previous Krillian invasions. Initial estimates put the approaching swarm at over 3,000 vessels. The human patrol force had exactly 12 ships. Zex, quote, Thara, prepared to watch the complete annihilation of Earth's military forces. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Even if every human weapon hit its target perfectly, they could not destroy enough enemies to make any difference. She began composing her report for the council, explaining how quickly the humans had been eliminated and recommending that no future species with similar limitations should be accepted for membership. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of retreating or calling for reinforcements, the human fleet began moving directly toward the approaching swarm. Zex quote, Thera checked her instruments twice, certain there had been some mistake, but the readings were clear. 12 human ships were advancing to attack 3,000 Krillian vessels. Either the humans were completely insane, or they knew something about warfare that the rest of the galaxy had never learned. The first battle reports from the Helix Nebula made Zexithara question whether her equipment was malfunctioning. According to sensor data, the human ships were not only refusing to retreat, but they were somehow still fighting after 6 hours of continuous combat. This was impossible. The Krillian swarm had never taken more than 2 hours to destroy any defending force. Their bioships could regenerate damage faster than most weapons could inflict it. Their acid-spitting weapons dissolved enemy armor within minutes. Their boarding pods carried warriors that could tear through metal bulkheads with their bare claws. Yet the humans were still transmitting tactical communications on open channels, and their voices sounded almost cheerful. This is Captain Ben Carter of the UES Ranger, came a transmission that Zexithara intercepted. We have successfully rammed the lead Krillian dreadnought. Ship is heavily damaged but still operational. Requesting permission to ram the next largest enemy vessel. Zexithara stared at her communication screen. Ramming was not a tactic. Ramming was what happened when you lost control of your ship and crashed into something by accident. No military commander in the galaxy would deliberately collide with an enemy vessel because both ships would be destroyed. Admiral Kate Sullivan's response came through clearly. Permission granted, Captain. Make it count. The sensor reading showed Carter's ship, the UES Ranger, pulling away from the wreckage of a Krillian bioship that was twice its size. The human vessel had somehow survived a direct collision that should have turned it into space debris. Even stranger, the Ranger was accelerating toward another enemy ship while broadcasting what humans apparently called music at maximum volume. Zex. Quote, Thara had studied thousands of battles, but she had never seen anything like this. The humans were fighting as if normal physics did not apply to them. Their ships performed maneuvers that should have torn them apart from the stress. They flew through asteroid fields at speeds that made collision inevitable, yet somehow avoided hitting anything important. Captain Morrison's ship led a group of human vessels in what could only be described as organized chaos. Instead of maintaining proper formation, the human ships scattered in different directions, forcing the Krillians to divide their attention. When enemy bioships tried to follow individual human vessels, they found themselves isolated and surrounded by the rest of the human fleet. The tactical recordings showed scenes that violated everything Zexithera knew about space combat. Human ships flew close enough to enemy vessels that their hulls were almost touching. They fired weapons at point-blank range while spinning wildly to avoid return fire. In several cases, human gunners were manually aiming their cannons because the targeting computers could not track enemies during such violent maneuvers. Lieutenant Lisa Martinez led a squadron that attacked a Krillian command cluster using a tactic that had no name in any military database. Her ships dove through the enemy formation while firing in all directions, then used the enemy vessels themselves as cover while reloading their weapons. When the Krillians tried to pursue, they ended up shooting each other instead of the humans. But it was the boarding actions that truly confused Zexithara. Sergeant Amy Chen had somehow managed to capture a Krillian command ship using nothing but portable weapons and mining explosives. The combat recordings showed her team fighting in zero gravity, while their own ship spun out of control around them. The humans were not wearing proper combat armor. They had no gravity boots to keep them oriented during the battle. They communicated through simple radio headsets instead of sophisticated tactical networks, yet they moved through the chaotic environment as if they had trained for exactly this situation their entire lives. "Left side, Amy," shouted one of Chen's soldiers as a Krillian warrior burst through a bulkhead. "Duck and roll!" Chen dropped to the floor, rolled sideways while firing her weapon, and came up behind a piece of debris that provided cover. Her team moved like they were dancing together, each person anticipating where the others would be without any complex coordination system. The Krillian warriors were larger, stronger, and better armed than the humans. Their natural weapons could slice through metal, and their acid spit could melt human flesh in seconds. But they seemed confused by the humans' constant movement and unpredictable tactics. More disturbing was the way humans reacted to casualties. When one of Chen's soldiers was killed by Krillian acid, the rest of the team did not retreat or become cautious. Instead, they became more aggressive. They started taking greater risks and attacking more violently. This behavior made no sense from a military perspective. Rational beings became more careful when they started losing people, not more reckless. Self-preservation was supposed to be the strongest instinct in any intelligent species. Yet the humans seemed to operate according to completely different principles. They fought harder when conditions got worse. They took bigger risks when they were outnumbered. They found ways to laugh and joke even while under heavy enemy fire. Captain Helen Stone's destroyer had lost its main engines and half its weapon systems after a direct hit from Krillian bioplasma. Any reasonable commander would have ordered the crew to abandon ship. Instead, Stone had her people manually steer the vessel using small thruster rockets while throwing everything they could find out of the airlocks to use as projectiles. Zex, quote, Thara, watched in amazement as the crippled human ship fired kitchen equipment, furniture, and spare machinery parts at approaching Krillian fighters. The improvised ammunition was completely ineffective against enemy armor, but it forced the Krillians to constantly adjust their flight paths to avoid collisions. While the enemy fighters were distracted by flying debris, Stone's gunners used the ship's remaining weapons to target weak points in Krillian bioarmor. The strategy was absurd, but it was actually working. "This is Stone to all human vessels," came the captain's voice over the communication channels. "We are now officially a garbage cannon. requesting additional ammunition from any ship with spare junk to throw. 3 other human vessels immediately began launching their own improvised projectiles. Within minutes, the space around the battle zone was filled with floating obstacles that turned the engagement into a 3-dimensional obstacle course. The Krillians, who relied on speed and agility to overwhelm their enemies, found themselves struggling to navigate through clouds of random debris. Their bioships were designed to heal from weapon damage, but they had no defenses against constantly bumping into floating refrigerators and computer terminals. Even more confusing was the psychological effect of human behavior on Krillian warriors. The swarm species had evolved to feel no fear and show no mercy. They had conquered dozens of civilizations without ever encountering resistance that made them question their own superiority. But humans did something that apparently had never happened in Krillian history. They made the swarm creatures doubt themselves. Major Dan Parker had landed his ground forces on Kepler Station after it was overrun by Krillian warriors. Instead of attempting a conventional assault to retake the facility, Parker's troops had turned the station's own life support systems into weapons. They manipulated atmospheric pressure to create sudden decompression events that launched Krillian warriors into space. They adjusted temperature controls to make certain areas of the station too hot or too cold for enemy occupation. They even reprogrammed the artificial gravity generators to create localized gravity fields that crushed Krillian formations while leaving human soldiers unaffected. The Krillians had never encountered enemies who used the environment itself as a weapon. Their warrior instincts were adapted for direct combat against other living creatures, not for dealing with opponents who could make walls explode or floors disappear without warning. By the end of the first day of fighting, something unprecedented was happening to the Krillian swarm. For the first time in their recorded history, they were retreating from a battle they had not yet won. Zex, Thara realized she was witnessing something that would change her understanding of warfare forever. The humans were not winning through superior technology or numbers. They were winning by refusing to follow any rules that their enemies could predict or counter. She began to suspect that the galaxy had been thinking about military conflict in completely the wrong way. By the 3rd day of the battle, Zexathara had requested permission to move her observation ship closer to the fighting. She needed to understand what she was seeing because it challenged everything she thought she knew about warfare and military psychology. The Krillian swarm had been expanding across the galaxy for thousands of years. They were a species that had evolved specifically for conquest, with each individual willing to die without hesitation for the collective's goals. Their warriors knew no fear, felt no pain, and never retreated from any battle. Yet something was happening to them in human space that had never occurred before. The swarm creatures were displaying what could only be described as uncertainty. Zex, Thera, monitored Krillian communication channels and found their tactical transmissions filled with requests for guidance that their command structure had never needed to provide before. Swarm warriors were asking questions like, "What do we do when enemies ram us intentionally?" And, "How do we counter weapons that should not exist?" The humans had introduced variables into warfare that the Krillians could not adapt to quickly enough. Every time the swarm developed a counter tactic for one human strategy, the humans would immediately switch to something completely different. Major Dan Parker had successfully retaken Kepler Station using methods that had no names in any military manual. When the Krillians adapted to his environmental warfare by bringing their own atmospheric suits, Parker's forces adapted even faster by rigging the station's artificial gravity systems to create crushing forces in specific locations. But it was not just the tactical innovations that confused the Krillians. It was the emotional intensity that humans brought to every engagement. Zex, Thara had studied the psychological profiles of dozens of species, and she understood that most intelligent creatures became more cautious when facing superior odds. Self-preservation. Instincts caused rational beings to minimize risks when survival was threatened. Humans appeared to operate according to the opposite principle. When conditions became more dangerous, they became more aggressive. When they were outnumbered, they took bigger risks. When they started losing people, they fought with greater intensity rather than pulling back to regroup. Captain Helen Stone's crippled destroyer had been reinforced by 2 other human vessels that were also heavily damaged. Instead of retreating, to repair their ships, the three captains had decided to combine their remaining resources into what they called a battle group of last resort. Stone's ship provided the weapons platforms. Captain Bobby Clark's vessel contributed its engines and maneuvering capability, and Captain Nancy Rodriguez's ship served as a communications hub and ammunition supply. The three vessels flew in close formation, sharing power and resources while coordinating their attacks against much larger Krillian bio-ships. The improvised battle group made no sense from an engineering perspective. Three damaged ships working together should have been less effective than three undamaged ships fighting separately. But somehow the human commanders had found ways to make their weaknesses become strengths. When Stone's destroyer ran out of traditional ammunition, Clark's ship provided covering fire while Rodriguez's crew manufactured new projectiles from spare parts and debris. When Clark's engines overheated from excessive maneuvering, Stone's ship used its remaining power to create an electromagnetic field that helped cool the overloaded systems. The cooperation was seamless and immediate, as if the three human crews had trained together for years. Yet Zexathara's record showed that these captains had never served together before this battle. Even more puzzling was the way humans used communication during combat. Most species maintained strict radio discipline during battle, transmitting only essential tactical information to avoid giving enemies intelligence about their plans. Humans filled the communication channels with constant chatter that served no apparent military purpose. They told jokes while under fire, shared personal stories during brief lulls in the fighting, and offered encouragement to teammates who were struggling with difficult situations. "Hey Rodriguez, remember that time you crashed your shuttle into the Admiral's swimming pool?" called Captain Clark during a particularly intense firefight with Krillian interceptors. "That was an emergency landing," Rodriguez replied while her gunners targeted enemy weak points. "And I saved 3 lives doing it." "Yeah, but you also ruined a perfectly good pool party," added Captain Stone, as her ship launched another salvo of improvised projectiles. The humans were actually laughing while fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Zexathara could not understand how beings could maintain such emotional lightness in situations that should have induced terror and despair. But the strangest aspect of human psychology revealed itself when Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Foster led a boarding assault against a Krillian command vessel. Foster's team included soldiers who had been wounded in previous battles but refused medical evacuation. Sergeant Pete Williams had lost 2 fingers on his left hand during the fight for Kepler Station. Private Linda Scott had suffered burns across 30% of her body when her previous ship was hit by bioplasma. Corporal Mike Davis was fighting with a leg injury that should have disqualified him from active duty. Any rational military force would have sent these soldiers to medical facilities for proper treatment and recovery. Instead, they were volunteering for the most dangerous missions and performing better than uninjured troops. "We started this fight together," Williams explained to Foster, when the colonel suggested he should accept medical evacuation. "We finish it together." The wounded soldiers moved through the Krillian vessel with a fury that seemed to increase rather than decrease as they encountered resistance. When they found evidence that the bioship had been used to attack human civilian transports, their behavior changed dramatically. Zexathara had observed many species during combat, but she had never seen anything like what happened to humans when they discovered enemies had targeted non-combatants. The change was immediate and absolute. Foster's team stopped taking prisoners. They stopped offering surrender terms. They stopped following standard rules of engagement that normally governed civilized warfare. The Krillian warriors they encountered were larger, stronger, and naturally armed with claws that could slice through metal. But the humans fought with an emotional intensity that seemed to make them physically stronger and faster than should have been possible. Corporal Davis, fighting with his injured leg, somehow managed to tackle a Krillian warrior that was twice his size and tear it apart with nothing but a combat knife and what could only be described as pure rage. Private Scott, despite her serious burns, moved through the enemy ship like she was invincible, destroying everything in her path while screaming words that Zexathara's translation system could not properly interpret. The psychological effect on the Krillian defenders was unlike anything in their species' history. Warriors who had never known fear began to retreat from individual human soldiers, creatures that had been bred for fearless aggression, started avoiding confrontations with enemies they should have been able to defeat easily. When Foster's team reached the command center of the bioship, they found something that changed the nature of the entire conflict. The vessel's organic computers contained tactical data about Krillian plans to attack human colonies that had no military defenses. Foster transmitted this information to Admiral Sullivan with a message that was heard throughout the human fleet. They are targeting our families. The response from Sullivan was unlike any military order Zexathera had ever monitored. There were no tactical coordinates, no strategic objectives, no discussion of acceptable casualties or rules of engagement. There were only 4 words: no prisoners, no mercy. What followed redefined Zexathera's understanding of what intelligent beings were capable of when they stopped trying to be civilized. The human fleet stopped behaving like a military force and started behaving like something else entirely, something that had no equivalent in galactic civilization. Captain Morrison's ship led an assault formation that abandoned every principle of space combat doctrine. Human vessels closed to point-blank range with Krillian bioships and fired everything. They had not just traditional weapons, but reactor cores set to overload. Cargo holds full of debris turned into massive projectiles, and in one case, an engineer named Joe Martinez, who actually jettisoned himself in a spacesuit with explosives to manually destroy a Krillian command node. The humans had stopped fighting a war. They were now fighting for something that Zexathera was beginning to realize was far more dangerous than any military objective. They were fighting for the right to protect what they loved, and they were willing to do absolutely anything to ensure that right was preserved. The Krillians, who had conquered 17 star systems, began to discover what it meant to face an enemy that cared more about winning than about surviving. The turning point came when intercepted Krillian communications revealed their next target: a civilian transport convoy carrying human families evacuating from frontier colonies. The convoy had no military escorts and no defensive capabilities. It was simply 3 cargo ships full of children, elderly people, and others who could not fight. Zex. Thera monitored Admiral Sullivan's reaction to this intelligence, expecting to hear orders for the human fleet to intercept and protect the convoy, using standard defensive tactics. What she heard instead was something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sullivan's voice came through the communication channels with a coldness that made Zexathera's scales shiver. "All human vessels, this is Admiral Sullivan. The enemy has chosen to target our families. From this moment forward, we are no longer bound by any rules of engagement. No prisoners will be taken. No mercy will be shown. Hunt them down and destroy every single Krillian ship in this sector." The change in the human fleet was immediate and absolute. Ships that had been fighting with remarkable creativity and courage suddenly became something else entirely. They transformed into instruments of focused destruction that operated according to principles Zexathera had never encountered in 3 centuries of military observation. Captain Morrison's UES Defiant led the first wave of what could only be called a hunting expedition. Human ships scattered across the star system in a pattern that made no tactical sense, until Zexathera realized they were not trying to control territory or achieve strategic objectives. They were simply trying to find and kill every Krillian vessel they could locate. The humans stopped fighting like a military force and started fighting like an extermination squad. Captain Ben Carter's ship, the UES Ranger, pursued a group of Krillian fighters that were trying to retreat toward the edge of the system. When his weapons ran out of ammunition, Carter ordered his crew to load the main cannon with pieces of the ship itself. They fired bulkhead plates, furniture, spare machinery, and eventually parts of the engine room at the fleeing enemies. When the Ranger's engines failed from the damage, Carter's crew didn't abandon the ship. Instead, they set it on a collision course with the largest Krillian vessel they could target and continued firing manually operated weapons until the moment of impact. Zex quote, Thera watched in horror as the human ship exploded against the enemy bioship, taking both vessels out of the battle. But instead of being saddened by the loss, the other human captains seemed inspired by Carter's sacrifice. Commander Patricia Woods led a squadron of human destroyers in a pursuit of retreating Krillian forces that defied every principle of military logistics. When her ships ran low on fuel, she ordered non-essential systems shut down and continued the chase on backup power. When they ran out of traditional ammunition, her crews used debris from destroyed enemies as projectiles. One of Woods's ships was completely disabled by Krillian bioplasma, its crew trapped inside a vessel that could no longer maneuver or fight effectively. Rather than surrender or wait for rescue, the crew set their reactor to overload and guided their ship into the middle of a Krillian formation, creating an explosion that destroyed 6 enemy vessels. The psychological warfare that humans had been using throughout the battle intensified to levels that bordered on the supernatural. They began broadcasting messages on all frequencies that were clearly designed to terrorize their enemies rather than coordinate military actions. "This is Captain Tony Walker of the UES Vengeance," came one transmission that Zexthara recorded. "We know you can understand our language, Krillians. We want you to know that we are coming for every single one of you. You touched our families. And now you will learn why that was a mistake you will never get the chance to make again." The humans started hunting Krillian vessels with a persistence that went beyond military necessity. They would pursue individual enemy ships across multiple star systems, following them through asteroid fields and nebula clouds for days at a time. Captain Helen Stone's battle group, still flying in their improvised formation of 3 damaged ships, detected a Krillian command vessel trying to escape toward dark space. Instead of letting it go and focusing on more immediate threats, Stone's group followed the bioship for 18 hours through a region of space filled with navigation hazards. When they finally cornered the enemy vessel in a dead-end asteroid cluster, Stone's gunners didn't simply destroy it quickly. They systematically targeted non-essential systems first, disabling the Krillian ship piece by piece while broadcasting a message explaining exactly why they were doing it. "You wanted to kill human children." Stone's voice carried across all communication channels. "Now you get to experience what it feels like to die slowly, while someone stronger than you decides how long you suffer." The tactical recording showed human crews working with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical perfection, but their faces showed emotions that were purely organic and terrifyingly intense. They moved through their ships, making repairs, loading weapons, and coordinating attacks while displaying expressions of focused hatred that Zexthara had never seen on any intelligent species. Lieutenant Lisa Martinez led a boarding party that captured a Krillian bioship by cutting through its hull. With improvised thermal lances made from overloaded weapon systems, her team fought through the enemy vessel room by room, not to capture intelligence or secure tactical advantages, but simply to kill every Krillian warrior they could find. The humans had stopped treating the battle as a military conflict and started treating it as personal vengeance. Major Dan Parker's ground forces landed on 3 different Krillian staging areas and systematically destroyed everything they found. They didn't capture equipment for analysis or take prisoners for interrogation. They simply burned, exploded, or dissolved every trace of enemy presence they encountered. When Parker's troops found evidence of Krillian plans to attack human schools and hospitals, they became something that Zexthara could only describe as monsters wearing human faces. They started taking Krillian prisoners just so they could execute them slowly, while forcing other enemy warriors to watch. The effect on Krillian morale was catastrophic. Warriors who had never known fear began abandoning their posts and fleeing toward dark space without waiting for orders. Bioships that had been bred for aggressive expansion started avoiding any region of space where human vessels might be present. Most disturbing of all was the way the Krillian command structure began to break down. The swarm species operated according to collective decision-making processes that had evolved over millions of years. Individual Krillians rarely acted independently because their society was built on the principle that the group was more important than any single member. But humans had introduced something into the equation that Krillian psychology could not process. They had demonstrated that some enemies cared more about revenge than survival, and that some battles were worth fighting even when victory was impossible. The swarm mentality that had made Krillians so effective as conquerors became a weakness when facing opponents who refused to be conquered. Individual Krillian warriors started making decisions based on personal fear rather than collective strategy. Some bioships began retreating from battles they should have won. Others broke formation and fled toward dark space without regard for the tactical situation. A few actually surrendered to human forces, something that had never happened in recorded Krillian history. Captain Joe Martinez, floating in space in his damaged EVA suit after manually destroying a Krillian command node, was picked up by a human rescue ship 12 hours later. He was nearly dead from oxygen deprivation and radiation exposure, but the first words he spoke were a request to return to combat duty. When told that the battle was essentially over because the remaining Krillian forces were fleeing the system, Martinez's reaction was pure frustration. "They can't leave yet," he said. "We're not finished with them." That sentiment was echoed throughout the human fleet. Admiral Sullivan received dozens of requests from her captains asking permission to pursue the retreating Krillians into dark space. The humans didn't want the battle to end because their enemies were running away. They wanted to continue fighting until every single Krillian ship was destroyed. Zex quote. Thara realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans had not just defeated the Krillian swarm through superior tactics or technology. They had actually traumatized an entire species that had been specifically evolved to be immune to psychological warfare. The Krillians were fleeing, not because they could not win, but because they had encountered something that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligent life. They had discovered that some creatures would choose mutual destruction over surrender, and that some battles were fought for reasons that transcended rational calculation. As the last Krillian bioships disappeared into dark space, Zexithara found herself completely reassessing everything she thought she knew about warfare, strategy, and the capabilities of different species. The humans had won not by being stronger or smarter than their enemies, but by being willing to care about something more than their own survival. In the aftermath of what historians would later call the Helix Nebula campaign, Zexithara found herself completely unable to write her report to the Galactic Defense Council. Every time she tried to explain what had happened, the words seemed inadequate to describe what she had witnessed. The humans had not won through superior technology. Their ships were still primitive compared to most galactic standards, held together with what appeared to be determination and spare parts. They had not won through superior numbers. They had been outnumbered by margins that should have made victory mathematically impossible. They had not even won through superior strategy in any traditional sense. Their tactics had been chaotic, unpredictable, and frequently suicidal. By every measure that Zexithara had used to evaluate military effectiveness for 3 centuries, the human fleet should have been annihilated within the first few hours of contact. Instead, they had achieved something that no military force in galactic history had ever accomplished. They had made the Krillian swarm retreat not just from a battle, but from an entire region of space. Admiral Kate Sullivan's after-action briefing provided some insights, but raised even more questions. "We didn't fight them ship to ship," Sullivan explained to the assembled human officers. "We fought them idea against